The strangest thing about one of America's great forests is that it did not grow by escaping fire. It grew by learning how to live with it. Welcome to Sleepy Drift into Knowing, where knowledge does not rush past, but slowly unfolds like the last light of evening settling over a quiet forest. And on tonight's journey, we are stepping into the world of the longleaf pine, a tree that may seem familiar at first, yet holds one of the deepest stories nature has ever told. At first glance, the longleaf pine might seem like just another name among countless other pine species. But the closer you get, the stranger its story becomes. In its earliest years, it does not hurry to grow tall. It does not fight for sunlight or put its strength on display. Instead, it stays low to the ground, like a delicate tuft of grass, as if it is quietly preparing for a very long life ahead. And yet this same tree can stand firm against fires that force so many others to retreat, not because it is strong in some loud and obvious way, but because long ago it evolved to move in rhythm with the soil, the heat, the passing of time, and the quiet lives rising all around it. That is also what makes the longleaf pine more than just a tree. It does not simply live inside an ecosystem. It helps create an entire living world. Beneath those long, open needles, there is light, there is grass, there are wildflowers, there are birds, there are insects, and there are tiny creatures whose fate is tightly bound to its presence. And the more we listen to this story, the more we begin to understand something gentle and immense at the same time. In nature, the most enduring kind of strength is not always about resisting every hardship. Sometimes it is about learning to live in harmony with what seems harshest of all. So tonight, if you would like to follow us all the way to the heart of this truth, dim your screen just a little, let your mind relax, and stay with this journey. Because by the time we reach the end of the story of the longleaf pine, you may not only understand more about a single tree, but also feel more clearly how life on Earth is woven from fire, from time, from patience, and from quiet but lasting connections. And if you truly enjoy these calm, gentle journeys into the unknown, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment about what surprised you most. Tonight, we will begin very slowly with a single tree, and then travel farther and farther until the whole forest appears like a vast thought breathing in the dark. When night settles over the sandy stretches of the southeastern United States, the longleaf pine does not appear like an ordinary tree standing among others in the forest. It feels more like an ancient marker of the land itself. Its scientific name is Pinus palustris, and it belongs to the pine family, Pinaceae, a group of gymnosperms that has existed for a very long time in the evolutionary history of plants. The longleaf pine is native to the southeastern United States, with its natural range stretching from Virginia down through the Atlantic and Gulf Coast states, across North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into eastern Texas. That range alone tells us that the longleaf pine is not some small regional tree with a local name. It is part of a vast biological map, a living being that learned how to live with warm climates, nutrient-poor soil, intense sun, coastal winds, and the natural fire cycles of an entire region. Even its name, longleaf pine, immediately points to its most striking feature. Its needles usually grow in bundles of 3 and measure about 8 to 18 inches long, or about 20 to 46 centimeters. They are dark, soft, and gently drooping, like long threads catching the wind. At the ends of the branches, they gather into dense clusters, giving the crown a look that feels graceful, airy, and unexpectedly soft in a way many other pines do not. Those needles gave the tree its name, and they also gave it a very distinct presence among the pines of the American South. If you place it next to a loblolly pine or a slash pine, the longleaf pine often looks more open, less heavy, as if each branch has deliberately left room for light to pass through. That is not just surface beauty. It is the first sign that the longleaf pine does not survive by closing off the world around it, but by opening it up. Once mature, a longleaf pine can reach 60 to 120 feet tall, which is about 18 to 36 meters, and under favorable conditions, its trunk can rise like a straight, tall, restrained column. Its major branches do not crowd the tree from bottom to top the way they do in many other forest species. Instead, they are usually spaced apart, large, strong, and clearly arranged, creating an open crown that feels irregular yet deeply ordered. Because of that, mature longleaf pine forests do not feel dark and crowded like closed canopy conifer forests. They feel more like vast natural parks, places where light still reaches the ground, where wind can still move between the trunks, where a person can walk and breathe deeply without feeling swallowed by shadow. So the longleaf pine is not simply a tree that grows upward to occupy space. It creates its own kind of space, its own ecological architecture, and simply standing beneath it is enough to understand that a forest can feel spacious, calm, and full of light. If the needles give the longleaf pine its softness, the bark tells a very different story. A story of endurance. When the tree is young, the bark is fairly simple, but over time it becomes thick, rough, and broken into plates, shifting from warm orange-brown to gray-brown, until it forms hard, flat sections like armor shaped by decades and centuries of sun and fire. On older trees, that bark can be about 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches thick, which is about 1.9 to 3.8 centimeters. That detail may sound small, but it hides something enormous. A tree with bark that thick is telling us that its life was never meant to avoid hardship. The longleaf pine was born into a world where heat, drought, and fire had to be reckoned with from the very beginning. So even its bark is not just there to cover the wood. It is part of its survival strategy. In the longleaf pine, form always goes hand in hand with function, and its beauty has never been separate from its resilience. Then there are the cones, and once again the longleaf pine shows how unusual it really is. Its cones are the largest of any pine in eastern North America, usually measuring about 6 to 10 inches long, which is about 15 to 25 centimeters. When mature, they are reddish-brown, shaped somewhere between an egg and a cone, with thin scales tipped by small curved spines. On the same tree, both male and female reproductive structures appear, and when young they can show surprisingly vivid shades of bluish-purple or deep purple. To many people, a pine cone is just a dry object lying on the forest floor. But in the longleaf pine, the cone is a quiet reminder that the continuation of this species is anything but simple. Every large cone is the result of time, weather, sunlight, competition in the canopy, and even the fire cycles that kept the forest open enough for the parent tree to stand wide and produce cones. Even the seeds of the longleaf pine do not want to fall onto a forest floor buried under thick litter and shade. They germinate best when they reach exposed mineral soil, the kind that often appears after the right kind of surface fire. So from the very beginning of reproduction, the longleaf pine has tied its fate to the rhythm of the entire landscape around it. The deeper we go into the life of the longleaf pine, the more clearly we see that it does not choose easy places. This tree usually grows best in full sun, on acidic, well-drained soils rich in sand, sometimes clay or mixed soils, but in general it is associated with places low in organic matter, poor at holding water, and far from fertile by ordinary human standards. When it is still very small, the longleaf pine quickly invests in a deep taproot, so deeply that transplanting it becomes difficult unless it is done with proper technique. That detail is worth pausing on. While many trees rush to pour energy into their trunk and crown, the longleaf pine quietly sends its energy downward first, as if it understands that if it wants to live long on hot, dry ground, it must first learn how to anchor itself deeply in the place where it belongs. This is one reason why the longleaf pine is so well adapted to drought, and one reason it is considered the most drought-tolerant of the southern pines. In the longleaf pine, the depth of the root system is the truest explanation for the calm strength of the trunk above the ground. What makes it even more interesting is that the species name palustres in Latin means belonging to the marsh, or of wet places. Hearing that, many people would imagine the longleaf pine as a tree of mud, low ground, and year-round wetlands. But the most defining reality of the longleaf pine is its strong connection to dry, sandy soils, uplands, sandhills, and open, sunlit savannas. That slight mismatch between its name and its familiar habitat makes the longleaf pine even more fascinating, because it reminds us that science is not just a set of labels placed on things. It is also a long process of correcting incomplete assumptions through careful observation. And the longer people observed it, the more they realized that the longleaf pine is not some fragile tree of easy places. It is a tree of harsh but rhythmic conditions, where the soil is poor, the sun is strong, and fire keeps returning, and those very forces, instead of eliminating it, gradually shaped the form we see today. If we only look at a single longleaf pine standing alone, we are still seeing only half the story. The most remarkable thing about this tree is not that it is tall or beautiful, but that it shapes the landscape instead of simply living inside it. The crown of the longleaf pine is usually open. Because of that, light is not trapped entirely overhead, but can fall all the way to the ground. When light reaches the ground, grasses and herbaceous plants can hold their place. When that ground layer of grasses and herbs stays healthy, surface fire can move through in the characteristic way that defines this ecosystem. When fire continues to move through regularly, dense competing woody trees are held back. And when the canopy remains open, the longleaf pine continues to preserve the very world that helps it survive. In other words, the longleaf pine does not merely grow in a forest. It helps create the conditions that allow that forest to remain itself. From light to grasses, from fire rhythm to spatial structure, everything is connected around the longleaf pine, like the moving parts of a vast and ancient ecological clock. That is also why the longleaf pine feels so different from many other southern pines. Some other pine species may grow faster in the eyes of short-term forestry and may produce dense, straight stands better suited to faster timber production. But the longleaf pine suggests an entirely different logic. It does not rush to fill every inch of space. It leaves room for light. It allows the ground to remain visible. It gives the forest visual depth, paths for the wind, room for grass, wildflowers, insects, birds, and in the end, room for human imagination as well. So when we stand before a longleaf pine, we are not simply standing before another pine tree. We are standing before a kind of ecological philosophy written in wood, bark, needles, and light. That philosophy is simple and profound at the same time. A living thing can become stronger not by taking everything for itself, but by creating a structure in which many forms of life can exist together. At that point, the longleaf pine begins to move beyond the boundaries of botany and becomes a quiet lesson in the generosity of nature. From here on, when we think about the longleaf pine, perhaps we should not think only of a straight trunk, a cluster of long needles, or an enormous cone. We should think of a living being that shaped its own form to match a very specific land. We should think of long needles not only as something beautiful, but as a declaration of identity. We should think of thick bark not only as a sign of age, but as a way to endure. We should think of deep roots not only as a way to stand, but as a way to live long. We should think of an open crown not only as a source of airiness, but as a way of letting light move downward so that other life can rise upward. And when all of those things come together, the longleaf pine appears exactly as it truly is, not a tree trying to survive in the world, but a tree that evolved to operate together with the world around it. We still have not reached the end of the story of the longleaf pine, but even here, simply by looking closely at its trunk, needles, bark, cones, roots, and posture, it has already quietly shown us something unmistakable. It is not ordinary in the most beautiful sense of that word. It is a tree capable of opening up an entire landscape from the moment we first begin to call it by its true name. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to step deeper into this forest. Because once we realize that the longleaf pine is not just a tree, we become ready for even stranger things waiting ahead. A tree that can spend many of its early years still lying close to the ground. A tree that seems in no hurry to grow, yet is preparing for an extraordinarily long life. A tree that makes fire not only a threat, but part of its coming-of-age story. And the moment that thought lightly touches our imagination, the longleaf pine forest begins to change from a landscape into an explanation. That explanation tells us that in nature, the most enduring things are usually not the loudest ones, but the ones that understand most deeply the rhythm of the place where they belong. The longleaf pine knew that long ago, long before human beings learned how to name it, measure its height, or write about it in any book. Once we begin to see the longleaf pine as a living being with its own distinct form, we also begin to understand that if we truly want to understand it, we have to know where it belongs. Some trees can be recognized well enough just by their trunk, their leaves, and their bark. But with the longleaf pine, calling it by the right name is still not the same as understanding its true nature. The longleaf pine is native to the southeastern United States, stretching from Virginia down to Florida, then curving along the Gulf Coast through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into eastern Texas. That is a vast region, but not every part of it is the same. And that is exactly what makes the longleaf pine so remarkable. It is not tied to a single landscape. It belongs to an entire family of connected landscapes where the climate is warm, the light is strong, the soil is often poor in nutrients, and the rhythm of plant life is deeply shaped by water, by topography, and by fire moving across the ground. So when we say that the longleaf pine belongs to the American South, we are still only naming the outer layer of the truth. More deeply, the longleaf pine belongs to a kind of world where soil, light, grass, and open space matter almost as much as the tree itself. The first misunderstanding is easy to make. People often imagine that the longleaf pine is simply a tree of dry, poor sands, as if it survived only in places where other trees did not want to live. But researchers who study this ecosystem have emphasized that this idea is incomplete. It is true that many of the remaining longleaf pine communities today are found on sandy hills, slopes, or land that is difficult to farm. But those are mostly just surviving fragments of a world that was once far richer and far more extensive. Over thousands of years, even very small differences in soil type, slope, elevation, moisture retention, and exposure to sunlight changed the way fire moved, changed the biological productivity of each site, and from there changed the height of the trees, the character of the grasses, the insects, the birds, and even the mood of the forest itself. In other words, the longleaf pine may be the same species from place to place, but in each place it is living inside a slightly different version of the same song. And that diversity is part of what gives the world of the longleaf pine its greatness. It is not monotonous. It varies, but it varies within a very deep order. In the driest places, the longleaf pine appears on sandhills, long ridges of loose, deep sand that drain very quickly, stretching from southern Virginia down into Georgia, and also appearing in scattered places across the Florida Panhandle and Peninsula. In some parts of the Carolinas, that sand can be several feet deep, or more than 100 feet deep, which is over 30 meters. The soil is poor, it does not hold water well, and the summers can be very dry. So here the longleaf pine is often shorter, more widely spaced, and surrounded by a very distinctive understory where wiregrass, bluestem, and many drought-tolerant herbs live alongside scrub oaks like turkey oak and bluejack oak. At first glance, that scene can make a person think of a harsh landscape, almost an empty one. But the longer you look, the more you realize that this openness is exactly what makes it precious. On the sand hills, the longleaf pine does not seal off the sky. It leaves wide pools of light for grass to live, for flowers to bloom, for the ground not to be claimed entirely by shade. And because the grass layer remains healthy, surface fire can still move through in its own rhythm, often every 2 to 7 years, keeping that world open, bright, and still true to the place where the longleaf pine belongs. If fire is absent for too long, scrub oaks gradually close in overhead, and the forest becomes something else. So even the geography of a sandy ridge is enough to show us that the longleaf pine never stands alone. It lives within a landscape structure governed by a very strict logic. But if we leave the dry sandhills and move into rolling uplands with better drainage, the story of the longleaf pine changes in a gentler way. In those rolling hills, the ground is not too flat, not too wet, and not too severely dry. The land undulates just enough for water to drain away, yet still remains stable enough to support excellent longleaf growth. In those places, the soil is often a brown, sandy loam, sometimes with limestone or fossil-bearing layers beneath it, and the longleaf pine can grow into beautiful stands that are tall, straight, and highly valued for timber. But more important than timber production is the ecological feeling the longleaf pine creates there. Native grasses, clumps of bunch grass, flowering herbs beneath the trees, together with native oaks and shrubs, form a forest that is not dark and dense, but deep, spacious, and full of breathing room between the trunks. Fire here usually returns more often, about every 1 to 3 years, because the native grass layer is thick enough to carry it. And that timing helps keep the longleaf pine dominant while preventing broadleaf trees from easily closing the middle layers of the forest. In places like this, we begin to understand that topography is not just the stage where the tree grows. Topography is what writes the rhythm of longleaf pine life, from the roots all the way to the crown. And if we continue downward into flatter, lower ground, closer to tidal influence, the world of the longleaf pine opens into yet another expression of itself: the flatwoods and savannas. Here the land is very level, often poorly drained, with a higher water table, and the landscape may include wet grasslands or shallow, seasonally saturated depressions. In these flatwoods, the longleaf pine can grow in denser stands and reach greater height, even rising above 120 feet, which is more than 36 meters, in especially favorable places. But the wonder of this region is not only the height of the trees. It is the extraordinary richness of the low vegetation. The Longleaf Alliance describes this as the habitat type with the greatest diversity of herbs and shrubs beneath longleaf pine canopies. Carnivorous plants such as sundews, pitcher plants, and even Venus flytraps in the right areas, along with countless orchids, grasses, and wildflowers, can all exist in the same world beneath the longleaf pine. It sounds almost like a contradiction, but a large forest tree like the longleaf pine helps sustain one of the most finely detailed ground layers in the southern United States. And that is exactly what makes it so different from the familiar image of a pine forest as something dark, closed, and monotonous. Here, the longleaf pine doesn't block all the light. It regulates the light. It doesn't suppress the understory. It supports it. There is a beauty in longleaf pine forests that photographs do not always manage to hold on to. If a person is used to closed canopy conifer forests, they often imagine pine woods as places where the ground is buried under dry needles. Few other species can live below, and the whole space feels dense, dark, and somewhat sealed off. But mature longleaf pine forests, when they are close to their historical natural condition, are different. Forestry descriptions tell us that they once existed as open, park-like forests, with large trees overhead, grass-dominated ground layers below, and light reaching nearly everywhere. The moment that image changes in our mind, the whole world of the longleaf pine changes with it. We are no longer standing before a dense green wall. We are standing in a place with openness, rhythm, and order, a place that feels good to the human eye and easy for the human breath. And it is exactly that open structure that allows so many other relationships to function. When light reaches the ground, herbaceous plants live. When herbaceous plants live, fire has a path to follow. When fire moves through regularly, the longleaf pine keeps its advantage. The more deeply we think about it, the more clearly we see that the longleaf pine does not merely occupy the landscape. It gives the landscape its shape. Changes in moisture also change the whole way the world around the longleaf pine appears. In the driest positions, the forest floor may be sparse, with more exposed sand, more scattered drought-tolerant shrubs and grasses, and the longleaf pine itself often shorter and leaner. On mesic uplands, meaning moderately moist upland sites that drain well and often have sandy loam over clay, the longleaf pine stands in forests with extremely rich understories. There, wiregrass tends to dominate across the southeastern part of the range from Mississippi to North Carolina, while bluestem grasses become more prominent farther west in Louisiana, Texas, and deeper inland in some states. It is still the same longleaf pine, yet differences in soil moisture and geography change the grass species at its feet and change the companions it lives among. That may sound like a small detail, but it points to a very large ecological truth. A tree never truly lives alone. Every longleaf pine exists inside a living arrangement of soil, water, grasses, shrubs, insects, fungi, birds, and fire. When one element changes, the feeling of the whole forest changes with it. So the longleaf pine does not just teach us about plants, it forces us to learn how to see systems. Even along the northern edge of its range, the longleaf pine enters montane regions, where the land rises higher and becomes rockier, steeper, and more ridged than the usual image of the coastal plain. The Longleaf Alliance describes montane longleaf pine as once dominating south and southwest-facing slopes and ridgetops up to about 2,000 feet, which is about 610 meters in northern Alabama and northwestern Georgia, with another isolated band extending from Pine Mountain to Thompson in Georgia. There, the longleaf pine grows on well-drained soils mixed with pebbles, sandstone, quartzite, mica schist, and gneiss, meaning on geological foundations very different from the deep sands of sandhills or the wetter flats of flatwoods. Fire moves differently there too. Sometimes it creeps down a ridge, and sometimes it runs upward along a slope. That alone is enough to show how broad the world of the longleaf pine really is. It can move from the coastal plain into low mountain slopes, from very dry ground into moister places, from white, nutrient-poor sands into upland soils with loam and clay, so long as the rhythm of light, competition, and fire remains right. In that sense, the longleaf pine is like a grand theme written over and over again in different materials. In every landscape it takes on a different tone, but it keeps the same soul. And because geography and soils vary so much, no two longleaf pine forests are ever completely the same. Silvix of North America records that the longleaf pine system has been classified into 135 different plant associations, and that diversity depends heavily on soil texture, soil moisture, latitude, and fire regime. That number is not just a technical detail. It tells us that the longleaf pine is not a symbol of sameness, but the supporting framework for a very wide range of landscapes. In one place, it stands over wiregrass, scrub oaks, and open white sand. In another, it rises over moist flatwoods filled with wildflowers, carnivorous plants, and seasonally wet meadows. In yet another, it stands on rocky ridges where it meets the boundaries of other southern pine forests. The more we understand that, the less we see the longleaf pine as a static image. It becomes a flexible ecological principle, capable of changing tone from place to place while holding on to its core nature, an open canopy, a love of light, a connection to a living ground layer, and a dependence on disturbance that arrives in the right rhythm. That is why, when we hear the phrase longleaf pine forest, we should not picture a thick green wall. A truer image would be longleaf pines standing far enough apart for the sky to remain present, tall enough for the wind to move through, open enough for the ground to remain an essential part of the forest. Beneath those trees, the grasses and herbs are not just decorative background. They are the other half of the landscape. They determine how fire travels. They keep the forest from closing in. They feed insects. Insects feed birds. And birds become part of the movement within that open space. So if someone walks into a longleaf pine forest and finds it more open than expected, that feeling does not mean the forest has become poorer. In fact, it may be a sign that the forest is still true to itself. The longleaf pine is beautiful, not because it piles everything into one dense green mass, but because it leaves room for the world around it to exist as well. And in nature, properly kept open space is often a very subtle kind of abundance. The more we place the longleaf pine on its real map, the more clearly we see that geography does not merely give it a place to stand. Geography gives it character. Deep sandy soils teach the longleaf pine thrift and drought tolerance. Poorly drained plains teach it how to live beside wet grasslands, low shrubs, and an unusually diverse ground layer. Rocky ridges and hillsides bring it into transitional edges where it touches other forest types while still keeping its own distinct identity. The distance from Virginia to Texas is not just a line on a map. It is a long school of evolution, where the longleaf pine learned how to adapt to many variations of the same great order. And once we understand that, we also begin to see the central truth of this story. The longleaf pine is not merely a tree surviving in nature. It is a tree that co-created itself with the place where it belongs. Soil, elevation, moisture, light, grasses, and fire all helped write the form of the longleaf pine. And then the longleaf pine, through its open canopy and its very way of being, wrote back onto the landscape. It is a two-way relationship, very old, very quiet, and very beautiful. So yes, it is true to say that the longleaf pine grows in the American South. But that still is not enough. A truer and gentler way to say it is this: the longleaf pine belongs to a very particular world of the American South, a world of open forests instead of closed ones, a world where light reaches the ground, a world where grass is not treated as something lesser, but as something essential, a world where even small changes in topography can alter the shape of the forest. A world where the same species can live on dry white sands, on brown rolling hills, on damp low flats, and even on rocky ridges, so long as the right relationships are still intact. And once we see the longleaf pine inside that world, we no longer see it as a tree standing in the middle of a landscape. We see it as a bridge between soil and light, between openness and abundance, between place and life. From there, the longleaf pine forest begins to appear not as a location, but as a living order, where everything is connected by threads that are fine, enduring, and almost never loud. And then, once we know where the longleaf pine belongs, we begin to touch something even stranger. A tree that lives on land like this cannot simply learn how to grow. It has to learn how to wait. It has to learn how to endure sunlight, competition, ground that shifts between dry and wet. And above all, a world where fire is not a rare emergency, but a familiar part of life's rhythm. This is where the story of the longleaf pine is about to open into an even deeper layer, because perhaps the place it belongs to has prepared it for a fate very different from what we usually imagine for a tree. Not to hurry upward, not to avoid danger completely, but to learn how to enter the rhythm of the very world that gave birth to it. And as soon as that thought begins to form, we become ready to see the longleaf pine in an even quieter truth, and a much stronger one. Some living things do not mature by escaping hardship, but by growing up inside it. And it is from that very place that the strangest secret of the longleaf pine begins to reveal itself. Most trees, once they sprout, seem eager to rise as quickly as possible, as if height were life's first answer. But the longleaf pine chooses a path that is almost the opposite. Its seeds do not go through a long dormant period like many other southern pines, so after they are dispersed, they may germinate in just a few days to a few months, often during the fall. That early beginning helps reduce the risk of the seeds being eaten by birds, insects, and small mammals before they can take root. From the very first moment, the longleaf pine shows that it does not delay life, but it also does not reveal life in the way people expect. It enters the world early, and then immediately steps into a much more patient strategy. Longleaf pine seeds can germinate on many kinds of surfaces, but for the seedlings to survive well, they need to reach exposed mineral soil, not a thick layer of dry leaves or a tightly packed blanket of forest litter. Both older silvicultural texts and modern restoration guides emphasize that fallen pine needles and broadleaf litter can significantly interfere with the longleaf pine's ability to take root and stabilize during its earliest stage. So in the world of the longleaf pine, even germination is never separate from the landscape around it. The ground has to be opened. The light has to be sufficient. Competing plants have to be held back. And very often, it is low-intensity surface fire that clears the stage for exactly that, burning away part of the litter layer so the seed has a chance to touch the soil it needs most. In other words, even while it is still only a seed, the longleaf pine is already living in a conversation with fire, not in an attempt to escape from it. When the longleaf pine has just germinated, it does not look anything like a tree that will live for centuries. Newly emerged seedlings usually carry short primary needles with a slightly bluish cast, and then within about 2 months, those are replaced by longer, greener secondary needles. There is a beautiful detail in this early stage that the Longleaf Alliance often points out. A young longleaf pine may still hold on to the thin wing of its seed, even as its first needles begin to spread apart. That image makes the seedling seem as if it is still carrying the final trace of its short flight from the mother tree to the earth. But after that initial fragility, what happens next is one of the boldest choices in the plant world. The longleaf pine almost stops growing in height. It does not immediately become a clear young sapling with an obvious trunk. Instead, it stays pressed close to the ground, forming such a dense tuft of needles that at a glance it looks more like a clump of grass than a pine tree. And that is why this period is called the grass stage. At first, the grass stage of the longleaf pine can make people think of slowness, or of some passive pause before the tree begins to truly grow. But the science of the longleaf pine shows the opposite. While it is barely increasing in height, it is pouring most of its resources into work that almost no one can see. It develops a powerful root system, especially a deep taproot, while also thickening the root collar and storing reserve carbohydrates. Silvix of North America describes this very clearly. During the grass stage, the longleaf pine directs its resources toward root development, increasing the diameter of the root collar, maintaining its needles, and storing energy. In other words, while the surface appears quiet, the foundation of life is working intensely below. The longleaf pine has not forgotten how to grow. It is simply putting growth in a place that matters more, somewhere the human eye cannot see, but time will never ignore. That is why the grass stage of the longleaf pine should never be understood as some meaningless delay. It is a strategy. It is a very deep investment in the ability to live a long time in an environment that is anything but easy. A strong root system helps the longleaf pine tolerate drought on sandy soils that drain quickly. The steadily enlarging root collar is a sign that the tree has accumulated enough energy to enter its height growth phase. And the carbohydrate reserves in the taproot are not extra material. They are the biological bank account of the longleaf pine, the reserves it will later draw from when the time comes to surge upward. So the silence of the longleaf pine during the grass stage is actually an extremely productive kind of silence. It is like a pause on the surface so that a much larger construction project can be built underneath. In the world of the longleaf pine, patience is not the opposite of growth. Patience is the first form of growth. The length of time a longleaf pine remains in the grass stage is not fixed. Under favorable conditions, it may leave this stage after only about 1 to several years. The Longleaf Alliance gives a common range of 1 to 7 years, while silvicultural overviews from the United States Forest Service note that the longleaf pine may remain in the grass stage for as long as 15 years, and there are even unpublished observations suggesting that some individuals may stay there even longer when competition is strong or resources are limited. Low light, lack of moisture, nitrogen deficiency, or crowding from shrubs and other woody plants can all extend this waiting period. That may sound harsh, but it is entirely consistent with the logic of the longleaf pine. This is a tree that does not rise simply because time has passed. It rises when the roots, stored energy, available light, and open space around it all allow it to. It does not measure youth by the number of years. It measures it by the degree of readiness in both its body and the landscape around it. And then we come to the reason the grass stage of the longleaf pine is one of the most beautiful phenomena in fire ecology. While the tree lies close to the ground, its terminal bud is not exposed like an easy target for burning. It is surrounded by a dense cluster of needles, and the growing tissue at the tip is further protected by bud scales. Some studies explain that the root collar's position right at ground level, together with the insulation created by the needles and bud scales, allows young longleaf pines to survive many surface fires that other species would struggle to endure. When fire moves through, the outer needles may be scorched or even burned away, but the core growing point still has a chance to survive, and then quickly push out a new flush of needles. That image is worth lingering on for a moment. A young longleaf pine that looks like grass, brushed by fire, and then turning green again from the very place that seemed injured. That is not a miracle. That is evolution written into shape. Still, it would not be fair to the truth to tell the story as if the longleaf pine were immune to fire. Its fire resistance is remarkable, but it is not immortal. Newly germinated seedlings, before they fully settle into the grass stage, are still highly vulnerable to fire, drought, and animals that feed on young sprouts. Even once they are in the grass stage, their ability to survive still depends on their size, the position of the root collar, and the specific conditions of the burn. One research document from the United States Forest Service notes that when grass-stage longleaf pines reach a root collar diameter of about 3/10 of an inch, which is about 0.8 centimeters, they already show very high fire resistance, even during the growing season. More recent silvicultural summaries note that trees with a root collar diameter greater than about 6/10 of an inch, or about 1.5 centimeters, have a much more clearly improved chance of surviving fire. That matters, because it reminds us that the longleaf pine's strategy is not to ignore fire, but to grow steadily toward a threshold where fire can no longer remove it so easily. Nature here does not romanticize hardship. Nature simply selects with great patience. And because fire is part of that test, the longleaf pine faces a fascinating paradox. This tree depends on fire, yet its smallest young individuals can still be killed by fire if the timing comes too early or the conditions are too unfavorable. In plantation restoration, foresters even warn that if seedlings are planted too shallowly or the root collar has not grown large enough, fire can cause very high mortality. In the wild, the longleaf pine also has to contend with brown spot needle blight, a disease that can cause early needle loss, stunt young trees, and prolong the grass stage to the point that some never make the leap upward at all. That makes the story of the longleaf pine feel more real and also more moving. This is not the story of a tree protected by nature. It is the story of a tree making its way through a narrow corridor between risk and adaptation, where every detail, from a small patch of exposed mineral soil to a few extra millimeters in root collar diameter, can change the fate of an entire life. But it is only when we place the longleaf pine inside the repeated fire rhythm of the southeastern United States that we understand why fire is not its simple enemy. Before Europeans arrived, low-intensity surface fires moved through many longleaf pine landscapes at intervals of 1 to 10 years, sparked by lightning during the growing season and by intentional burning from indigenous people managing the land. Today, in restoration and management, prescribed fire is often applied on cycles of about 2 to 10 years, depending on the habitat, while many ecological recommendations emphasize that a fire return interval of 1 to 4 years is especially important for maintaining open structure and diverse understories in many longleaf pine communities. That means the longleaf pine did not evolve in a quiet and unchanging world. It evolved in a world repeatedly brushed by fires that were low, light, and recurring. In that world, fire did not arrive to end the story of the longleaf pine. Fire arrived like a strict editor, cutting away whatever made the forest too dense, too dark, and too closed for this tree itself. That is why forestry literature continues to describe the longleaf pine as both fire-tolerant and fire-dependent. The longleaf pine does not like competition. Without frequent fire, shrubs and broadleaf trees in the mid-story quickly grow up. Close the openings that the longleaf pine needs, add a thicker layer of litter to the forest floor, and eventually overwhelm young longleaf pines while they are still in the grass stage. Research on natural regeneration shows that fire helps reduce litter on the seedbed, reduces competition from woody understory plants, and stimulates grasses and herbs that depend on burning. Put very simply, fire helps keep the stage suitable for the longleaf pine. Without fire, the longleaf pine does not merely lose its advantage, it loses the very world that its body was designed to live in. So every well-timed burn is both a test and a clearing of the path that allows the longleaf pine to remain itself. Then, at some point, when the root collar of the longleaf pine reaches about 1 inch, which is about 2.5 centimeters, that long period of waiting begins to change rhythm. From late winter into early spring, the tree pushes up an elongated white shoot, often called a candle, and over a short period it can gain height very quickly, sometimes several feet in just a few months. The Longleaf Alliance calls this the rocket stage, and in morphological descriptions people also refer to a bottle brush stage, when the tree has just left the grass stage and still has a slender stem carrying clusters of needles along the young axis. That moment is one of the most dramatic movements in the life of the longleaf pine. After years of seeming not to grow at all, it suddenly accelerates, as if all that silent time had been compressed into a single upward burst toward the sky. But even here, the story with fire is not over. The newly emerging candle shoots are still fairly vulnerable until the new needles expand enough to protect them, or until the growing tip has risen above the usual height of a surface flame. There is something deeply lovable about this part of the longleaf pine's story. Its surge upward is not a rejection of the slow years that came before. It is the reward for them. Without a strong root system, without stored carbohydrates, without the root collar thickening little by little during the grass stage, the longleaf pine could never shoot upward that quickly. And precisely because it has stored so much strength so deeply, it can turn a body that once lay flat against the earth into a young tree climbing toward the light in a relatively short time. It does not grow because of luck. It grows because of preparation. That makes the longleaf pine one of the most beautiful examples of how, in nature, speed on the surface is often only the final expression of a quiet process that has been unfolding for a very long time. We see the longleaf pine leap upward like an arrow, but what made that arrow possible was years of living like grass without complaint. Once the longleaf pine moves beyond its most vulnerable young stage and reaches about 8 feet in height, which is about 2.4 meters, with a diameter near the base of about 2 inches, or about 5 centimeters, it becomes much tougher against surface fire. By then, the bark is thicker, the trunk has lifted its most vital living parts higher, and the lower branches are gradually removed by repeated heat, keeping the crown above the zone where fire usually sweeps through. Even more remarkably, once the longleaf pine is firmly established in the ecosystem, the layer of fallen needles it produces becomes a fine fuel that helps surface fire continue to move across the forest floor. There is a very strange circle here. When it is young, the longleaf pine needs fire to open the way, but it also has to be cautious of fire. When it matures, it not only tolerates fire better, but also helps sustain the conditions that allow surface fire to remain part of the landscape. It begins as a life form shaped by fire, and gradually becomes a life form that helps maintain fire's rhythm. And at that point, we see more clearly than ever that the longleaf pine does not live outside the system. It lives by taking part in the system. Perhaps that is why the story of the grass stage lingers so long in people's minds. It corrects one of our most common misunderstandings about strength. We often think strength means growing fast, appearing early, rising immediately in full view of everyone. But the longleaf pine says something different. In its early years, it accepts looking like grass. It accepts being passed over at a glance. It accepts placing the most important part of itself where no one can see it. And when fire comes through, the longleaf pine does not ask how to live in a world where fire no longer exists. It learns how to become a body that fire cannot easily erase. That is a profoundly biological lesson, but it is also a much wider one. In the world of the longleaf pine, harshness is not only a destructive force. Harshness, when it repeats in the right rhythm and within the right limits, can also be what selects the strongest structure, clears away competition, and keeps the whole landscape from slipping into another form of life. And then, if we listen closely enough, we begin to hear that the deepest secret of the longleaf pine is not how well it resists fire, but how it has allowed fire to take part in its coming-of-age story. Its seeds need ground that has been opened. Its young seedlings need breathing room from thick litter and competing plants. Its grass stage needs time to gather energy into the roots and the root collar. Its sudden upward burst needs exactly the right moment to leave the ground behind. And throughout that entire journey, fire is not only a test, it is part of the order that keeps the forest bright enough, open enough, grassy enough, rich enough in exposed mineral soil, and spacious enough for the longleaf pine to become the longleaf pine. So in the world of the longleaf pine, fire does not only destroy, it also selects, clears the way, and preserves balance. Once we understand that, we no longer see the longleaf pine as a lucky tree surviving in danger. We begin to see it as a living being that has learned how to grow in rhythm with the very thing that so many other species know only how to fear. And from here, the longleaf pine forest opens into yet another layer of meaning. Because if a tree can spend many of its earliest years building roots, enduring fire, waiting for an opening, and rising only when both its body and the landscape are ready, then it is certainly not living only for itself. A tree It learns how to live with fire in order to keep an entire world breathing around it. And when that thought quietly comes into view, we begin to feel ready for what comes next. Beneath the canopy of the longleaf pine, there is not only shade. Beneath the longleaf pine is an entire living community being upheld by this tree's slow strategy, deep roots, and refusal to close the world around it. If a longleaf pine can spend many of its earliest years pressed close to the ground and still remain perfectly in step with the world around it, then the next thing we need to understand is that it does not really live by the measure of seasons. It lives by the measure of centuries. Ecologists describe the life cycle of the longleaf pine in a series of very clear stages. The seed falling in late fall, the vulnerable young seedling, the grass stage lying low and pouring its strength into the roots, the sudden upward surge with its pale white shoot, then the young tree, the mature tree, the old tree, and finally the standing dead trunk that continues to nourish the ecosystem like a white pillar of memory. In the longleaf pine, those stages do not simply follow one another like steps of age. They are different ways of living within the same organism, and each one is shaped for a very long future ahead. That is why looking at a longleaf pine always creates a different feeling. It does not have the restless look of a tree racing against the world. It has the calm presence of a tree that accepted from the beginning that it would live so long it would need to learn more than one way of existing in a single lifetime. The longleaf pine is also the longest-lived of the southern pines in the United States. The Longleaf Alliance notes that an individual longleaf pine can often reach around 250 years of age, and some have been recorded at more than 450 years old. At Weymouth Woods Sandhills in North Carolina, the state park system still presents the site as the home of the oldest known living longleaf pine still in existence. That detail alone is enough to change the listener's sense of scale. A longleaf pine like that first sprouted before many modern nations had taken the shape we know today. It has lived through cycles of drought, storms, fire, insects, shifts in land use, years of abundant seed production followed by years of scarcity. And it still stands there like a biological landmark, quiet, but almost superhuman in its endurance. When we stand before a very old longleaf pine, we are not simply standing before the age of a tree, we are standing before time turned into wood, infused with resin, and shaped by wind and fire. What is strange is that the longleaf pine does not rush into reproduction. Under especially favorable planted conditions, such as seed orchards or old agricultural land with rich nutrients, it may begin producing cones fairly early after height growth begins. But in natural forests, where the longleaf pine must grow through competition, wind, sand, and the rhythm of fire, the production of cones with viable seeds is usually limited until the tree reaches a large enough size, which corresponds to about 20 to 30 years after height growth begins. The Longleaf Alliance also describes the longleaf pine as entering a clearly reproductive stage of maturity only around 30 years after the start of height growth. There is something beautiful in that, in a very particular way. The longleaf pine does not hurry into reproduction because its entire design gives priority to building the foundation first. It has to learn how to root itself, endure fire, build bark, lift its trunk, open its crown, and only then shift its energy more fully toward sending seeds into the future. In the logic of the longleaf pine, that delay is not a lack. It is the way a tree says that if it wants to carry life far into the future, it must first stand firmly enough in the present. Even after it reaches maturity, the longleaf pine does not keep growing forever. On richer soils, it may continue gaining height until it reaches about 108 feet, which is about 33 meters, while on poorer soils it may only reach about 59 feet, or around 18 meters. After roughly 70 to 100 years, the longleaf pine essentially stops making significant gains in height. But that pause is not the beginning of decline. From that point on, it enters a different kind of adulthood, one in which the trunk thickens, the crown gradually becomes flatter on top, the lower branches grow fewer because of fire and natural self-pruning, and the whole tree begins to take on the look of those great old giants once described as living utility poles. A mature longleaf pine forest, therefore, doesn't feel like a place full of noise and upward competition, where everything is still racing to rise. It feels more like a choir that has moved beyond rehearsal, where each trunk holds its place with certainty and restraint. The longleaf pine does not keep climbing forever, but once it stops reaching higher, it begins to go deeper into time. And it is in that old age that the longleaf pine reveals a very important truth about old forests. An old longleaf pine forest does not mean every tree in it is ancient. The Longleaf Alliance points out that even when a stand looks very old, with large trees, wide spacing, flattened crowns, and an unmistakably ancient feel, about 2/3 of the trees in it may still be younger than 50 years old. That sounds paradoxical, but it is exactly right in the ecology of the longleaf pine. Lightning strikes, tornadoes, hurricanes, surface fires, insects, and the small openings created by falling trees are constantly opening little windows in time. And in those windows, a new generation of longleaf pine begins its own cycle. So an old longleaf pine forest is a community of many overlapping ages, not a museum made up only of its oldest trunks. It is more like a library that holds books hundreds of years old, alongside pages that have only just begun to be written. The oldness of a longleaf pine forest doesn't come from every individual being ancient. It comes from the fact that the regeneration of many generations is still unfolding inside the same open structure. The more we think about that, the more we understand why the longleaf pine's early slowness should never be mistaken for weakness. Those grass stage years, when the tree almost disappears in the eyes of anyone passing by, are actually the opening chapter of a strategy built for centuries. The longleaf pine spends the first part of its life on roots, on the root collar, on stored carbohydrates, on drought tolerance, and on fire resistance, and only then does it send its trunk into the sky. Once that foundation is in place, it can grow upward quickly, and then enter the long span of life as a large tree, one that tolerates fire well and is often less troubled by insects and disease than many pines grown on shorter rotations. That is why the longleaf pine does not behave like a pioneer species whose only goal is to claim space first. It behaves like an architect, spending more time on the foundation than on showing off the roof. In a human world that often loves visible speed, the longleaf pine offers a very quiet lesson. The most important development usually happens before it becomes obvious. And perhaps that is why, when people stand before an old longleaf pine, they do not feel the noise of victory. They feel the reward of very long preparation. The trunk of the longleaf pine also carries an ability that makes it a remarkable witness to time. Its annual rings preserve traces of climate. A recent overview of the longleaf pine tree ring network explains that this species is one of the longest-lived trees in the southeastern United States, and that its yearly rings respond quite sensitively to shifts in climate and environment. The studies gathered in that review show that the width of longleaf pine rings is clearly related to rainfall, soil moisture, drought, and along the northern edge of its range, even winter temperature. Because of that, longleaf pine has been used in major drought reconstructions such as the North American Drought Atlas, and it has also been used indirectly to reconstruct changes in stream flow in some southeastern watersheds. There is something deeply beautiful in the fact that a tree standing still for hundreds of years can record the movements of rain, soil, and water that humans only learned to measure systematically much later. Every time a ring in a longleaf pine grows thinner or wider, it is not simply a matter of slower growth or faster growth, it is weather translated into wood. The longleaf pine can preserve more than climate. It can also hold the history of fire. Dendrochronology studies on longleaf pine show that scientists can reconstruct the frequency of past fires and sometimes even the season in which they burned, from fire scars inside the wood. A methodological report from Tall Timbers explains that in longleaf pines of the southeastern coastal plain, many ancient fire scars do not remain visible on the outside, but are buried near the base of the tree, covered over by new wood as the years pass. That means a longleaf pine can carry within itself an entire sequence of fires stretching across centuries, even while looking calm from the outside. The fact that researchers sometimes have to dig near ground level to find those buried scars creates an image that feels perfectly true to the spirit of this tree. The great events of a longleaf pine's life are not always displayed on the surface. Many of them have been absorbed, covered over with new wood, and turned into data for another age to read. Because of that, the longleaf pine does not merely tell us that fire once existed. It helps us understand how regularly fire returned across the landscape it helped shape. When annual rings and fire scars are read together, the longleaf pine becomes a record far larger than its own life. Researchers call it a foundation species of the longleaf pine ecosystem, but here we could also call it a living chronicle. It records both rain and drought, both easy years and parched years, both low frequent fires and subtle shifts in forest structure when landscapes become fragmented or when fire suppression lasts too long. The review of the longleaf pine tree ring network also emphasizes that the durable wood of this species survives not only in living trees, but also in stumps, standing dead trunks, and wood used in historic buildings, which allows time series in some places to be extended beyond 500 years. Put very quietly, the longleaf pine can live so long that it does not merely remember its own life. It helps human beings piece together the memory of an entire landscape from before rain gauges existed, from before satellite imagery, and even from before many forests were changed into the forms we know today. In the longleaf pine, time does not simply pass away. Time settles into the wood. Old age in the longleaf pine is not a perfectly motionless state either. The Longleaf Alliance notes that from around 80 years of age, many trees may begin to be affected by red heart fungus, which softens the heartwood and creates small hollow pockets inside. At very advanced ages, more and more trees begin to show signs of internal decay, and after about 300 years, those that have survived countless storms and disturbances gradually weaken and become less able to defend themselves against insects such as the black turpentine beetle or the southern pine beetle. But even then, the story of the longleaf pine is not over. When it dies, the bark may fall away, leaving behind a standing dead trunk as white as bone, a snag which continues to provide feeding sites, shelter, and nesting places for many other species. That gives old age in the longleaf pine a profound quality. It does not move from life into uselessness. It moves from one form of contribution into another. As the longleaf pine grows old, it does not merely gather more marks of time. It gradually transforms from a living tree into ecological structure, as if even its death is stretched into a useful stage for the world around it. Perhaps that is why, when we stand in an old longleaf pine forest, we so easily feel that time in nature is far deeper than the time human beings usually use to measure their own lives. A person may look at a longleaf pine and say it has been there a very long time. But the science of the longleaf pine pushes us much farther than that. It tells us how long the tree waited before leaving the grass stage, how many years it needed before beginning stable reproduction, when it stopped gaining height, what droughts and fires it kept inside each ring of wood, and why a truly old forest always contains both young trees and old ones living side by side. And when all those pieces are brought together, the longleaf pine appears as a tree that doesn't live by short bursts, but by the depth of continuity. It builds endurance before it builds height. It builds memory before it builds splendor. And because it lives for so long, the longleaf pine becomes more than a remarkable individual. It becomes a foundation of time for many other species to enter, remain, and then pass on beneath its canopy. A living being capable of holding time for that long will never be living only for itself. And from here, the world around the longleaf pine begins to come into clearer view, with birds, grasses, wildflowers, reptiles, insects, and countless other forms of life depending on that enduring rhythm in order to continue. And from that deep rhythm of time, the world beneath the longleaf pine begins to appear as something that almost seems impossible, at least if we think about trees in the usual way. Because the longleaf pine does not simply grow in order to claim a piece of sky for itself. It grows in order to create the conditions for countless other forms of life to exist beneath it. Official descriptions of the longleaf pine ecosystem keep returning to a few defining traits, almost as if they are inseparable from its very nature. The overstory is largely dominated by longleaf pine. The midstory is not tightly closed in by shrubs and small trees. The understory flourishes with bunch grasses, wildflowers, and many herbaceous species, and fire moves through often enough to keep the entire structure open. When we place those pieces side by side, we begin to understand that the longleaf pine is not just a tree. It is the living framework of an entire world. Not in the sense of a tree standing there while a few animals happen to take shelter nearby, but in the sense of an ecological structure so stable that many species evolved alongside it, depend on it, and can only fully become themselves when the longleaf canopy remains open, the forest floor remains bright, and the ground remains covered with rich herbaceous life instead of the darkness of a closed mid-story. That is why conservationists often say that the longleaf pine ecosystem is one of the most biologically rich ecosystems in the temperate world, and one of the most diverse for herbaceous plants in the southeastern part of North America. The National Park Service describes the longleaf pine ecosystem as one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the region, especially in its herbaceous layer, and also as one of the most severely threatened. The Longleaf Alliance goes even further and emphasizes that most of that diversity is held in the ground layer of the longleaf pine forest itself. That may sound surprising, because people usually look upward into the treetops when they search for grandeur. But in the world of the longleaf pine, the most wondrous part is often underfoot. The place our eyes are most likely to overlook is often the place where life is most crowded together. The longleaf pine keeps the light reaching the forest floor, and when that happens, hundreds of species of grasses, sedges, orchids, wildflowers, ferns, and other herbaceous plants can coexist in a biological tapestry that is low, quiet, and astonishingly rich. So if someone looks only at the number of tree trunks and decides that this forest feels sparse, they have missed the densest part of its life. In wet savannas and pine flatwoods that still keep a fire rhythm close to the natural one, the richness of the ground layer beneath the longleaf pine can reach a level that almost seems hard to believe. The National Park Service notes that in some wetland pine savannas, there can be as many as about 100 species of grasses and herbaceous plants in a single acre, which is about 0.4 hectares. Numbers like that are not just beautiful on paper. They explain why, when someone walks through a true longleaf pine forest, the ground beneath their feet is not covered only with fallen needles, but with a living carpet that shifts with the seasons. Wiregrass rising in clumps, blue stem changing color in the late light, blazing star drawing in bees, and butterflies, pitcher plants, and sundews waiting quietly in damp ground, and small orchids opening in places only the slowest walker would notice. By refusing to block the whole sky, the longleaf pine has allowed the ground to keep its dignity. And here, the ground is not a lesser background beneath the trees above. The ground is where biology truly bursts into bloom. So the longleaf pine does not just support a forest. It preserves the light that lets the forest unfold sideways, downward, and into its most delicate forms of diversity. When light reaches the forest floor like that, the grasses and wildflowers beneath the longleaf pine are not simply beautiful. They do essential work that few large trees could ever do on their own. That ground cover creates the fine fuels that carry surface fire, helping fire move steadily without easily turning into a canopy blaze that destroys the whole structure of the ecosystem. That same ground cover keeps shrubs and mid-story trees from easily closing the open spaces. It also becomes a source of seeds, nectar, tender leaves, insects, and egg-laying sites for countless birds, small mammals, butterflies, and native bees. The Longleaf Alliance explains very clearly that when the ground cover is healthy, maintaining a longleaf pine forest with fire becomes far more natural. That means that in the world of the longleaf pine, grass is not just grass, and flowers are not just flowers. They are part of the machinery that keeps the entire landscape functioning properly. And because of that, the longleaf pine is not merely the tall tree above. It is the open roof that allows the intricate system below to keep working. Rare worlds are almost never preserved by a single thing alone. They are preserved by small relationships repeated for so long that they become the foundation itself. Perhaps no species helps people feel that relationship more clearly than the red-cockaded woodpecker. This is a small bird with black and white striping that lives closely tied to mature open pine forests, especially longleaf pine forests maintained by fire. What makes the red-cockaded woodpecker almost a symbol of the longleaf ecosystem is its highly unusual nesting habit. While most woodpeckers excavate cavities in dead trees or softened rotting wood, this species excavates its nest cavities in living pines, usually trees old enough, large enough, and rich in the right resin characteristics. Both the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and the Longleaf Alliance emphasize that this is the only woodpecker in North America that regularly excavates cavities in living trees in this way. That detail alone tells us that the red-cockaded woodpecker cannot survive in just any pine forest. It needs old longleaf pines. It needs an open canopy. It needs a mid-story that is not too dense. It needs fire to keep its foraging pathways from being blocked. In other words, the red-cockaded woodpecker does not live beside the longleaf pine. It lives inside the very kind of world that the longleaf pine helps preserve. And once a pair of red-cockaded woodpeckers has managed to excavate a cavity, in the trunk of a living longleaf pine, the story still does not end there. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service notes that excavating a cavity like that can take from 1 to 3 years, and the Longleaf Alliance records that those cavities later become ecological resources for many other species. At least 27 species of vertebrates have been documented using those cavities for roosting or nesting. That is why the red-cockaded woodpecker is considered a keystone species, a species that plays a crucial role in the larger web of life. But if we look deeper, we can still see the longleaf pine behind that bird's story. Because for a cavity like that to remain on the landscape for years, there first has to be a longleaf pine old enough to hold it. And for the tree to grow that old, there must have been the right fire rhythm and the right amount of open space for many decades. And for that open space to remain open, the grasses and ground cover below must still be healthy. From one small cavity in a tree trunk, the whole ecosystem begins to reveal itself as a long and durable chain of connection. The longleaf pine here is not just supporting a nest. It is supporting the nesting possibilities of an entire secondary community that depends on those spaces hollowed out through time. If the red-cockaded woodpecker tells the story of old trunks, then the gopher tortoise tells the story of the ground beneath the longleaf pine. The gopher tortoise is the only native tortoise in the eastern United States, living primarily in upland pine forests and in the dry, open, well-drained habitats of the southeast. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service notes that the range of the gopher tortoise overlaps strikingly with the historic range of the longleaf pine ecosystem. That is not a random coincidence. The gopher tortoise needs ground that is easy to dig, abundant sunlight, low vegetation for feeding, and a landscape that has not been sealed off by shrubs and small trees. That is exactly the kind of world created together by the longleaf pine, surface fire, and healthy grass cover. When someone walks slowly through a longleaf pine forest in Florida, Georgia, or Alabama, the entrance to a gopher tortoise burrow may appear only as a half-moon shadow on sandy ground. But from that quiet opening, a whole lesson in interdependence begins to unfold. The burrow of a gopher tortoise is not just a home for the tortoise itself. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission states that more than 350 other species have been documented using gopher tortoise burrows. That is why the gopher tortoise is also considered a keystone species. In the world of the longleaf pine, that means a large tree in the upper layer keeps light on the ground. The ground is able to hold grasses and herbs. The open landscape allows the gopher tortoise to dig its burrow, and then that burrow becomes shelter for snakes, frogs, insects, small mammals, and many other creatures when the sun is too harsh, the cold runs too deep, or a fire has just moved through. Just imagining that chain once is enough to show that the longleaf pine does not merely support a few animals. It preserves a structure in which a burrowing reptile can become the host of an entire network. And there, the longleaf pine's contribution is not direct in the simple sense of fruit for animals to eat or bark for everything to cling to. Its contribution is more subtle than that. It keeps the whole landscape open enough, bright enough, dry enough where dryness is needed, and grassy enough where grass is needed, so that a species like the gopher tortoise can still do its work. Once those burrows exist in the sandy ground, the world beneath the longleaf pine reveals even more layers of life. The Longleaf Alliance notes that well-managed longleaf pine forests are home to many reptile and amphibian species, including some that are found almost nowhere else. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service also points to the close relationship between the longleaf pine ecosystem and species such as the eastern indigo snake. And many restoration stories today speak in the same breath about longleaf pine, gopher tortoises, and large native snakes. That makes perfect sense, because an open landscape with rich grass cover brings insects, frogs, small reptiles, and rodents with it, which in turn lifts the whole food web higher. Beneath the longleaf pine canopy, a frog does not merely need water. It needs refuge after fire, the right level of openness, so it is not crushed under deep shade, insects to eat, and small damp places tucked inside a world that is overall dry and bright. A snake does not merely need prey. It needs a whole landscape that still contains gaps, burrows, grassy strips, sunny edges, and cool pockets woven together. The longleaf pine, through its very refusal to close the world around it, has preserved all those overlapping microhabitats within the same forest. And when we come to insects and pollinators, the world of the longleaf pine becomes even more delicate. Many people look at a forest and see trees, but bees, butterflies, beetles, and countless other insects see a forest as a flowering map unfolding through the seasons. If the understory beneath the longleaf pine remains intact, each season can bring a different wave of blooming herbaceous plants, providing nectar and pollen in sequence rather than all at once in one short peak. The Longleaf Library summarizes a survey in longleaf pine savannas of Louisiana and Mississippi, showing that at least 122 bee species were collected at 4 survey sites in Louisiana. And when nearby savannas in Mississippi were added, the regional list rose to 165 species. That is a number large enough to make us stop and think. It means that beneath the longleaf pine canopy, the motion and buzzing that the human ear so easily overlooks is actually part of a vast pollination economy. Flowers such as blazing star may be covered with bees and butterflies during their blooming season, and their seeds later become food for songbirds. The longleaf pine does not create every flower, but it creates the kind of light and the kind of opening that still give flowers a chance to appear. In this story, the longleaf pine is like a quiet gatekeeper of biodiversity. So why does a more open longleaf pine canopy lead to such extraordinary richness of species? The answer lies in the distribution of light. But in a longleaf pine forest, where fire keeps the mid-story low and open, light flows more evenly across the forest floor. That light allows diverse ground cover to develop. The ground cover feeds surface fire. Surface fire keeps the openings open, and the entire cycle creates many different small habitats for countless species. That is why the National Park Service describes historic longleaf pine forests as open forests with thick layers of grasses and forbs, while the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and the Longleaf Alliance both emphasize the importance of an open canopy and open mid-story for birds, reptiles, pollinators, and ground-dwelling animals. So a longleaf pine with an open canopy is not passively giving up space. It is taking part in an architecture of light, where openness itself is the condition that allows abundance to happen. And the longer we look at this chain of connections, the more it becomes clear that it is not accurate to say that a longleaf pine forest is simply one tree supporting a few animals. The truer statement is that the longleaf pine is holding up a community. It keeps the upper layer from closing in, so the lower layer can stay alive. The lower layer feeds the fire, and the fire keeps the landscape open. The open landscape helps the red-cockaded woodpecker forage and nest in old longleaf pines. The open landscape also helps the gopher tortoise dig its burrows in warm, bright sand. The burrow of the gopher tortoise then supports hundreds of other species. The wildflowers at the feet of the longleaf pine call in bees and butterflies, and those insects become food for nestling birds, frogs, and lizards. If one link is lost, many others begin to tremble with it. So losing the longleaf pine does not simply mean losing a tree with a beautiful trunk, long needles, or valuable wood. Losing the longleaf pine means losing a rare kind of biological relationship, one in which a tree does not crowd out other forms of life, but instead creates the conditions that allow many forms of life to remain together. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson the longleaf pine teaches us at this point in the journey. A large living thing does not have to become important by being the most obvious presence in every moment. The longleaf pine becomes important because it preserves a living structure that so many other species are able to enter. As long as the longleaf pine is still there, as long as the light remains at the right level, as long as the grass layer keeps the right rhythm, and as long as fire still moves through in the right way, then birds, tortoises, snakes, frogs, bees, butterflies, wildflowers, and countless smaller forms of life can still find their place. But once the longleaf pine disappears, or once the landscape around it closes in, what is lost is not just the outline of a tree from the American South. What is lost is an entire order of mutual support, a kind of biological community that took thousands of years to form. And when that thought settles in, we begin to understand why the fate of the longleaf pine was never only the story of the longleaf pine itself. Because in the end, protecting the longleaf pine means protecting the possibility that a complex world can keep living together within the same forest. And once we see the longleaf pine supporting an entire living community beneath it, we also begin to understand why the history of people in the American South cannot be separated from the history of the longleaf pine. Some trees pass through human life like a silent backdrop. But the longleaf pine was different. It once covered more than 90 million acres, which is about 36 million hectares, from eastern Texas to southern Virginia, serving at once as landscape, building material, a source of resin, and a place for hunting, travel, and daily life. So when people entered the world of the longleaf pine, they were not simply stepping into a forest. They were stepping into a living system that already had its own order, an order that longleaf pine, fire, grass, and light had been sustaining together for a very long time before colonial economies and modern industry appeared. Long before the colonial era, many indigenous peoples of the southeastern part of North America lived with longleaf pine landscapes in a way that went far deeper than the idea of simply living near the woods. Overviews from the United States Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy both emphasize that this landscape was not some untouched wilderness completely beyond human influence. For a very long time, human-set fire helped maintain open forests, reduce fuel buildup, improve wildlife habitat, support hunting, and keep fire-dependent plant communities alive. Put gently, indigenous people did not merely live in longleaf pine forests. They understood their rhythm. They knew that if the land was to remain bright, if the grass was to keep breathing, if game was to return, and if travel routes were to stay open, then fire had to come at the right time and in the right way. In this story, the longleaf pine was not a victim of fire. It was part of a world that indigenous people had learned to care for through fire. That matters deeply because it corrects an old misunderstanding that longleaf pine landscapes were shaped only by lightning and chance. Lightning was certainly an important source of fire in the Southeast, but research from the United States Forest Service shows that the high fire frequency of the past was also linked to people intentionally burning the land to protect communities, improve hunting grounds, reduce the risk of severe wildfire, and maintain the habitats they wanted. Fire back then was not in conflict with human life. Fire was a tool of human life, and at the same time it was a tool that helped the longleaf pine remain the longleaf pine. There is a very deep harmony in that. The longleaf pine needed open forest. Indigenous people also benefited from open forest. So for centuries, the survival needs of people and the ecological needs of the longleaf pine were not entirely at odds. They met in the same low flames, moving across the ground and leaving behind a forest that was brighter, easier to walk through, and richer in life. But when Europeans arrived, the longleaf pine began to be seen through a different kind of gaze. In American forestry literature, the longleaf pine was once described plainly as the leading timber and naval stores tree, meaning the most important tree for lumber and for the maritime supply industry along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Settlers saw in the longleaf pine not only a beautiful landscape or an open ecosystem, but a storehouse of resources that could be measured, cut, distilled, transported, and sold. The trunks of longleaf pine were tall and straight, and their lower branches shed naturally, producing long, relatively clear wood suitable for houses, fences, floors, posts, beams, and many other structures that required durability. The Nature Conservancy also notes that shipbuilding in places like Chesapeake and South Carolina once depended on southern pine for masts and decking, while domestic demand consumed vast amounts of yellow pine for homes, plantation buildings, and countless forms of everyday architecture. From that point on, the longleaf pine began to enter history as a material of the economy, not merely as a member of an ecosystem. If the wood of the longleaf pine helped form the skeleton of houses and ships, then its resin helped create an industry that nearly shaped an entire region. A technical report from the United States Forest Service on naval stores explains that these products, including tar, pitch, turpentine, and rosin, helped keep the world's wooden fleets operating for a very long time before petrochemicals took over. Barnett described it as an industry that was memorable but also deeply messy, one that supported much of the Southern economy for nearly 400 years. In North Carolina, and in many parts of the longleaf belt, the term naval stores gradually narrowed until it referred mostly to tar, crude turpentine, and turpentine derivatives. Tar was burned out of pine wood and branches. Pitch was tar that had been further boiled down. Turpentine was distilled from resin. Rosin was the solid material left behind after distillation. When we slow down and look at those four products, we begin to see that the longleaf pine soaked into human history almost invisibly. It was not just a tree standing in the forest. It became rot-resistant rigging, leak-resistant ship hulls, paint, solvents, industrial materials, and cargo moving through seaports. So saying that the longleaf pine was part of the material backbone of a vast region is not an exaggeration. The longleaf pine helped build houses, build ships, sustain distillation industries, support ocean trade, and enter the everyday life of Southern residents. The United States Forest Service notes that before large numbers of non-indigenous settlers arrived, the longleaf pine already dominated tens of millions of hectares, which is tens of millions of acres. But within just a few centuries, that same abundance caused it to be seen as a massive reservoir of resources. When a tree provides timber, resin, and an enormous range across the land, the economy can begin to treat it as though it were nearly endless. And perhaps this is a very familiar moment in environmental history. Whatever seems too abundant is often treated as though it can never run out. The longleaf pine entered its tragedy through the very richness that once made it so important. But beneath all the statistics about trade, ships, and lumber, there is another history that has to be kept in view if the story of the longleaf pine is not to become too clean and polished. The Nature Conservancy, in its History of Longleaf in North Carolina, states very clearly that the growth of the naval stores and lumber industries was tightly bound to the forced labor of enslaved black people. That account notes that at the height of the turpentine industry, nearly 10,000 enslaved men were working in turpentine forests, while thousands of sawmills were operating across the region. On turpentine plantations, the labor force was made up largely of enslaved Africans, hired African workers, and a small number of white laborers. Even when we are speaking about a tree, we still have to remember that the longleaf pine entered history not only through land management or merchants, but through sweat, violent labor, and human bodies forced to work in the pine woods. Saying that does not make the story less gentle. It makes it more real. The longleaf pine supported an economy, but that economy was also held up by profound injustice. The way people extracted resin from the longleaf pine gradually changed the fate of the species itself. Silvix of North America notes that in the early to mid-19th century, large areas of longleaf pine were killed in what were called turpentine orchards to serve the naval stores industry. Repeated cutting, chipping, and wounding of the trunk to harvest resin did not merely weaken the trees. It ultimately caused many of them to die. In the eyes of the market, a longleaf pine trunk was no longer an individual that could live for centuries and support an entire biological community. It was broken into stages of extraction, resin first, then lumber later. The longleaf pine was forced to give more than its biological cycle was designed to endure. At that point, economic history and ecological depletion began to merge into one. Every scar cut into the bark of a longleaf pine was not just a wound on wood. It was a sign that the relationship between people and the forest was shifting from mutual dependence to one-way removal. Then, by the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, steam-powered technology pushed the pace of destruction even faster. The United States Forest Service records that steam-powered technology drove decades of rapid exploitation across most of the remaining longleaf pine forests. Another source within the same American forestry research system states that by 1900, logging, naval stores, and agriculture had reduced the area dominated by longleaf pine by more than half. In earlier times, harvesting had still been limited by navigable rivers and by the finite pulling power of animals. But mechanization allowed people to move deeper, faster, and more decisively into longleaf country. Old longleaf pines, trees that had taken centuries to become what they were brought down in such a short span of time that the forest had almost no chance to answer back. And so a tree adapted to the rhythm of centuries was suddenly forced to confront the rhythm of industrial extraction. Not many ecosystems can survive that collision intact. Still, the decline of the longleaf pine did not happen only because the trees were cut. After the forests were removed, longleaf recovery was held back by several causes at once. Silvix of North America explains that regeneration failures came from limited local seed sources, the destruction of seeds and seedlings by introduced pigs, the removal of fire from the landscape, and changes in land use. That is worth noticing, because it shows that losing the longleaf pine was not merely a matter of losing parent trees. When fire is removed from the system, when the ground is no longer opened in the right way, when seeds no longer come from nearby sources, and when land is converted into farms, pasture, or new development, then even a tree that once dominated an enormous region can struggle to return. The longleaf pine was never short on life. What it lost was the world it needed in order to regenerate. And that is a much deeper loss than the fall of a few trunks. It was in that context that a long-lasting misunderstanding about the longleaf pine's growth helped push it aside. Because the longleaf pine has that unusual grass stage and a slower beginning in height growth, many 20th century land managers and forestry operations saw it as a less attractive choice than loblolly pine or slash pine, species that were easier to plant, easier to manage on short rotations, and seemed to grow faster in their early years. A study from the United States Forest Service comparing the conversion from longleaf to loblolly describes very clearly how, over the past 3 centuries, the longleaf ecosystem was gradually replaced first by agriculture and later by loblolly pine farming. At the same time, the Longleaf Alliance has had to devote an entire section to correcting the myth that longleaf pine cannot compete economically with loblolly or slash pine, emphasizing that if time in the grass stage is shortened, early longleaf growth can compare well with other southern pines, and that it may even make up for a slow start with faster growth later on. That reveals a sad irony. The longleaf pine did not lose ground only because the ecology changed. It also lost ground because people misread the rhythm of its growth. As those management decisions multiplied across millions of acres, which is millions of hectares, the American South gradually shifted from a world of longleaf pine to a world of faster-growing, denser pine plantations often tied more closely to short-term production goals. Research from the United States Forest Service on woodland use change even frames this as a shift between 2 value systems, longleaf pine use on one side and loblolly pine farming on the other. That phrase is worth lingering over. It tells us that replacing the longleaf pine was not just a matter of changing species, it was a matter of changing the way people imagined a forest should be. An open longleaf pine forest, rich in ground cover, rich in surface fire, and rich in species, is not always ideal for the logic of short-term yield. But a forest like that is ideal for the long-term logic of biodiversity, resilience, and ecological value. When people began to see that second logic as less valuable than the first, the longleaf pine slowly retreated from its own homeland. And that is the moment when economic history quite literally became the history of ecological decline. By the end of the 20th century, the longleaf pine ecosystem had reached a painfully low point. Documents from the United States Forest Service record that the remaining area had fallen to about 3 million acres, which is about 1.2 million hectares, in the 1990s, while the Natural Resources Conservation Service states that over 2 centuries, development, timbering, and fire suppression had reduced this ecosystem by nearly 97% from its historic extent of more than 90 million acres, or about 36 million hectares. Those numbers are not just about forest land. They describe the degree to which a tree that once shaped the entire American South had been pushed to the margins of the very land that shaped it. Looking back across the whole journey, we can see that people both needed the longleaf pine to build houses, seal ship hulls, make profit, and settle the land, and also broke the chain of fire, grass, seeds, old trees, and regeneration that had kept the species alive for thousands of years. We used the longleaf pine to build a world of our own, but in the process, we unraveled the very world the longleaf pine needed in order to remain the longleaf pine. And perhaps that is the point that makes the story of the longleaf pine in human history feel both sad and profound. People were never indifferent to the longleaf pine. On the contrary, we were tied to it too deeply. We leaned on the wood of the longleaf pine, the resin of the longleaf pine, and the open forests of the longleaf pine in order to hunt, settle, work, trade, and grow wealthy. But because that need became too large, too constant, and more detached from the ecological rhythm of the landscape, the longleaf pine gradually disappeared from the place where it had once been the central presence. When a tree is asked to give more than the ecosystem around it can restore, being needed can itself become a form of destruction. So this historical story should not close with a simple accusation. It should close with a quieter recognition. People both needed the longleaf pine and helped erase it from its own homeland. And once we understand that, we begin to feel ready for the next chapter, where that decline is no longer just a memory, but appears as a real wound on the map, a great emptiness that, if we look at it long enough, we realize has taken away far more than a single tree. And it is here that the story of the longleaf pine enters its quietest chapter. Not because it matters any less, but because this is the part where a vast world begins to thin out right before our eyes. The longleaf pine once covered more than 90 million acres across the southeastern United States, which is about 36 million hectares, from eastern Texas through Florida to southern Virginia. Those forests were not only vast, they were also one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the region, with an open forest structure, a thick grass layer, recurring surface fire, and countless species of plants, birds, reptiles, and insects growing together in the same rhythm. But after 2 centuries of logging, development, and fire suppression, that area has declined by nearly 97%. Many official sources still describe the longleaf pine system as one of the most heavily threatened ecosystems in North America, and one federal assessment even ranked it as the 3rd most endangered ecosystem in the United States. When we hear numbers like that, we are not only hearing the loss of a tree species, we are hearing the thinning of an entire kind of world. The decline of the longleaf pine did not happen like a storm that comes and goes. It happened more slowly, more gradually, and for that reason it was also harder for the people living within it to truly notice. First came logging, then the conversion of land to agriculture, grazing, residential areas, roads, and other forms of development. After that came a change even more subtle, but no less destructive: fire suppression. While most modern people are taught that less fire is always better for forests, the longleaf pine system was built by repeated surface burns. So when fire was removed from the landscape, what disappeared was not merely a dangerous element. What disappeared was a foundational ecological process. Without fire, the longleaf pine could no longer live in the very world its body had evolved to understand. It was like an ancient instrument still holding its shape, but the music it needed in order to sing had been cut away. That is why fire suppression, the practice of stopping all those small repeating fires, became so dangerous for the longleaf pine. Documents from the Southern Research Station explain very clearly that beginning around the 1920s, fire suppression allowed longleaf pine savannas to be replaced by denser communities layered with overstory trees, woody broadleaf midstory, shrubs, and low canopies stacked on top of one another. Another source from the United States Forestry Research System also notes that in the absence of fire, competition from hardwoods takes over the understory, greatly reducing or even eliminating opportunities for longleaf pine regeneration and reducing food resources for wildlife. In other words, fire once helped the forest breathe. When fire disappeared, the forest began to compress in on itself. The canopy was no longer as open as before. Light became trapped overhead. The ground began to darken. And the longleaf pine, a tree that needs open light and exposed mineral soil in order to regenerate, gradually began to lose its place in the very land it had once shaped. When fire is absent for long enough, hardwoods, broadleaf trees that tolerate shade better and grow fairly quickly in the mid-story begin to move into the openings that the longleaf pine once held. A study published in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change explains that pine needles in open pine forests are an important fuel for surface fire, while hardwood leaf litter can weaken those flames. The study also emphasizes that too many hardwoods lead to canopy closure and the loss of diversity in the ground layer. This creates a spiral that is worth thinking about. When fire becomes less frequent, hardwoods increase. When hardwoods increase, the fuel becomes less suitable for effective surface burns. When surface fire becomes less able to move evenly through the forest, hardwoods gain even more advantage. So if the rhythm of fire is interrupted for long enough, the entire landscape begins to slide into another form. At that point, the longleaf pine is not simply cut down. It is replaced step by step by a forest structure created quietly by the absence of fire itself. But the deepest loss is not the longleaf pine trunk standing above the ground. The deepest loss lies on the forest floor. The Longleaf Alliance calls the ground cover of the longleaf pine system the source of most of the biodiversity in the entire ecosystem, and emphasizes that native ground cover species provide the fine fuels needed for prescribed fire, as well as for the natural role of fire itself. When the broadleaf midstory closes in and light no longer reaches the ground, grasses, sedges, wildflowers, and endemic herbaceous species begin to fade. Once the ground cover disappears, the longleaf pine forest loses not only its soft, bright beauty, but also the operating system that kept it stable for centuries. Without healthy ground cover, fire no longer moves evenly. Without regular fire, hardwoods press in more strongly. Without light, diversity in the lower layer shrinks even further. In those conditions, the longleaf pine does not merely lose its companions. It loses the very specific physical conditions that once allowed it to regenerate, grow, and keep the landscape open together with so many other species. That is why the decline of the longleaf pine is never just a botanical story. When this system contracts, the species that depend on it become trapped in landscape fragments that are smaller, more isolated, and more vulnerable. The National Park Service and many conservation groups repeatedly mention names that have become symbols of this ecosystem, such as the red cockaded woodpecker, the gopher tortoise, the Louisiana pine snake, and many other species that are threatened or under consideration for protection. But even beyond those better-known animals, a much wider network of pollinating insects, reptiles, amphibians, ground-dwelling creatures, and herbaceous plants also comes under pressure when open forest becomes choked forest. A species may still remain on the map, but if the landscape structure it needs has changed, that existence grows increasingly fragile. In the longleaf pine system, what species depend on is not simply the presence of the longleaf pine as a tree trunk. What they depend on is the whole logic of space: light reaching the ground, fire moving through, grasses carrying fuel, open patches, old trees, burrows, cavities, travel routes, and feeding space. To lose even one part of that logic is to leave many species in a condition where they are still surviving, but no longer truly at home. At that point, the characteristic open landscape of the longleaf pine slowly turns into a crowded one. From a distance, someone who has never known a true longleaf pine forest might look at denser woods and assume they are healthier because they look greener. But in the ecology of the longleaf pine, denser does not mean healthier. A forest with too much midstory, too much shade, and too little ground cover is actually a sign that the old ecological rhythm has been interrupted. Research and restoration guidance consistently show that when canopy closure increases and light in the understory decreases, the ground cover layer, where most of the system's species diversity is concentrated, becomes severely threatened. Many forests may still look like forests from the outside, but they are no longer functioning as longleaf pine forests on the inside. And perhaps that is the saddest loss of all. An ecosystem may still seem to keep its shape, but the music inside it has changed. The longleaf pine has not disappeared entirely from human sight, but the way the world around it breathes has already become different. So losing the longleaf pine does not simply mean losing trees with thick bark and long needles. Losing the longleaf pine means losing the operating logic of the land itself. Without surface fire returning often enough, the ground is no longer opened in the right way. Without a diverse layer of grasses and herbaceous plants, fire no longer moves as well as it once did. Without an open landscape, the species that need sunlight, ground cover, and open pockets of space also lose the conditions that sustain them. What has been injured here is not just the number of individual trees. What has been injured is the relationship among soil, fire, light, grass, birds, reptiles, insects, and the longleaf pine itself. Once that relationship is broken, planting a few rows of pines has never been enough to make the system return as it was. Because what was lost was not just the trees. What was lost was the ecological order that taught the trees and all the species around them how to live together. That is why the longleaf pine is so often described as one of the most threatened ecosystems in North America, not simply as a declining tree species. Reports from American conservation and forestry agencies continue to emphasize both the scale of the historic decline and the uniqueness of this fire-dependent system. When only a small fraction of the historical range remains, and when those remaining fragments are split apart by development, agriculture, roads, and long-term fire suppression, the danger does not lie in one sudden collapse. The danger lies in each small fragment becoming isolated, simplified, and gradually stripped of function. This makes the longleaf pine a very clear example of an ecological paradox. A system once so vast that it seemed impossible to lose ultimately became vulnerable precisely because people broke the small repeating rhythms that kept it alive. Not every environmental tragedy comes from one sudden act of destruction. Some tragedies come from no longer allowing an ecosystem to be itself. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand why the fragility of the longleaf pine does not come from weakness. The longleaf pine proved over thousands of years that it could live on poor soils, endure drought, survive fire, and withstand time longer than most of what grows around it. A tree like that is not fragile in the sense of being weak. What is fragile is the rhythm of life that once supported it. When people cut too much, changed too much land, suppressed fire for too long, and assumed that silence in the face of fire was safer than anything else, we severed the small but decisive cycles that kept the longleaf pine alive. The fire cycle, the cycle of open light, the cycle of regeneration, the cycle of grass, and the cycle of the forest floor itself. So if we wanted to say one very short thing about the decline of the longleaf pine, perhaps it would be this. What became fragile was not something weak, but something whose natural rhythms had been cut apart by human hands. And once we understand that, we begin to feel ready for the next part of the journey, where amid this great loss, there are still people trying to learn how to give the longleaf pine back the world it needs. But the story of the longleaf pine does not end with a once vast world shrinking to an almost unbelievable degree. What makes the longleaf pine more unusual than many other ecosystems is that even at the moment of its deepest decline, it still held on to enough biological memory for people to follow that trail and learn how to repair it. People are restoring the longleaf pine not only because they miss a beautiful tree, or because they want to place a few old forests back on the map. They are restoring it because they have gradually come to understand that when the longleaf pine is present in the right way, the land keeps a healthy fire rhythm, the grasses and wildflowers stay alive, water resources are better protected, many endangered species still have a home, and even landscapes that need to serve both conservation and human life become more sustainable. Put gently, restoring the longleaf pine means giving a region the chance to breathe again in the rhythm that once belonged to it. Over the past 15 years, that effort has no longer been just a scattered set of projects in individual forests. It has become a restoration movement across the longleaf pine's entire historic range. America's Longleaf, in its current conservation and action plan, says the goal remains to maintain, improve, and restore longleaf pine across the southeastern United States. In practice, that network is working across the 9 historic longleaf states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. The fact that a single tree species could inspire that kind of long-term alliance already marks a major change in the way people think about forests. The longleaf pine is no longer being seen as a leftover piece of the past. It is being seen as part of the ecological foundation of the region's future. The central goal of this movement sounds simple at first, but the longer you think about it, the more you realize it requires a rare kind of long vision. America's longleaf is still holding to its target of 8 million acres, which is about 3.2 million hectares, of longleaf pine across the region. Its 2025 to 2029 plan states that by 2023, total longleaf pine acreage had reached about 5.2 million acres, or about 2.1 million hectares, up from 3.4 million acres, which is about 1.4 million hectares, in 2009 when the coalition was formed. The updated conservation plan also emphasizes that to reach the 8 million acre goal, nearly 3 million more acres, which is about 1.2 million hectares, still need to be restored. What is beautiful here is that people are no longer talking about restoration as a vague dream. They can measure how far they still have to go. They can measure what has already grown. And they are treating the return of the longleaf pine as a real job, with a clear direction, real benchmarks, and real responsibility. But if we had to name the one key that truly unlocks restoration for the longleaf pine, it would still be fire. More specifically, prescribed fire. The United States Natural Resources Conservation Service emphasizes that one of the most beneficial management practices for the longleaf pine ecosystem is restoring the natural fire regime of the Southeast, where low-intensity burns once moved through every few years, keeping the canopy open and the herbaceous layer below rich and alive. That means restoring the longleaf pine does not mean trying to make the forest safe by never letting it burn again. It means learning how to let the forest burn in the right rhythm, at the right intensity, and in the right season so it can keep its identity. And perhaps that is one of the hardest lessons modern people have had to relearn, that sometimes, if we want to save an ecosystem, we do not have to stop every disturbance. We have to give it back the kind of disturbance that once kept it alive. Recent numbers show that people really are relearning that lesson at a large scale. America's Longleaf, in its 2024 accomplishments report released in June 2025, recorded more than 2.7 million acres of successful management activity across the full 9-state historic range, which is about 1.1 million hectares. In that same year, Longleaf Restoration Partners carried out prescribed burning on more than 2 million acres, or about 809,000 hectares, for the first time since annual achievements began being tracked, which was roughly 500,000 acres, or about 202,000 hectares, more than in 2023. That is no longer the scale of a few small groups who simply love forests. That is a level of coordination large enough for the map itself to begin changing in real ways. A region that had slowly become choked by the absence of fire is now, in some places, being combed back open by good fire, as if someone were gradually untying knots in the body of the landscape. Still, restoring the longleaf pine has never been only about bringing fire back. Just as the life of the longleaf pine itself does not begin with fire alone, its restoration also has to begin with seed, seedlings, soil, forest structure, and years of care afterward. The 2023 accomplishments report states that partners across the region planted 137,858 acres of new longleaf pine, which is about 55,800 hectares, protected 30,346 acres, or about 12,300 hectares, through land purchases and easements, carried out maintenance work on 231,122 acres, which is about 93,500 hectares, and applied silvicultural treatments on 6,539 acres, or about 2,650 hectares, to convert existing forests into longleaf-dominant stands. Those numbers matter because they show that restoring the longleaf pine is layered work. New planting is one part. Protecting land from conversion is another. Reshaping forest structure so the longleaf pine can regain its place is another. And only when all of those things move together does it become a real return. That is why the role of private landowners becomes almost decisive in this story. An updated report on longleaf pine status in the South notes that private ownership accounts for about 61.8% of the region's longleaf pine dominant forest type acreage. The United States Natural Resources Conservation Service also says that since 2010, its Longleaf Pine Initiative has helped private landowners restore nearly 1 million acres, which is about 405,000 hectares, through financial and technical assistance. That matters deeply because most of the future of the longleaf pine does not lie entirely inside national parks or public forests. It lies on land owned by families, production foresters, and people who live with their land every day. So restoring the longleaf pine cannot succeed if it remains only the language of conservation groups. It has to become a practical, workable, and long-term beneficial choice for the people who actually own the land. And this is where the cooperation becomes beautiful. The support programs now in place do not simply tell landowners they should love nature more. They offer guidance, cost sharing, technical instruction, seedlings, prescribed fire training, and management strategies that help landowners keep longleaf pine while also creating economic value through high-quality timber, poles, better wildlife habitat, and greater resilience against severe wildfire, disease, and strong winds. The United States Natural Resources Conservation Service also emphasizes that priority counties are often chosen near military bases, national forests, wildlife refuges, and heritage areas, so that restoration on private land can connect existing forest fragments into broader ecological corridors. That idea alone is beautiful enough. A landowner planting longleaf pine on private land may also be reconnecting a world for birds, tortoises, snakes, insects, and even the gentle passage of fire. Conservation organizations and public agencies also play a role that cannot be replaced when it comes to pushing restoration to the regional scale. The Longleaf Alliance, America's Longleaf, the United States Forest Service, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, military bases, national forests, and many other partners are each carrying part of the work that no single group could do alone. The Longleaf Alliance gives the example of the Gulf Coastal Plain Ecosystem Partnership, where 16 partners are jointly managing more than 1.3 million acres, which is about 526,000 hectares in northwestern Florida and southern Alabama, including much of the oldest longleaf pine still left in the world. Models like that show that restoring the longleaf pine is not simply a matter of dropping seedlings into the ground and waiting for something magical to happen. It is a long-term system of cooperation in which science, funding, fire training, endangered species monitoring, and land management all have to move together for years. Even new investments show that the longleaf pine is now being treated as a real priority, not just as a beautiful memory of the American South. In 2024, the Longleaf Alliance announced that it had been awarded $7.3 million to advance longleaf pine restoration and conservation. Among the projects it described was one that will plant 550,000 seedlings across 1,000 acres, which is about 405 hectares, carry out prescribed burning on 1,500 acres, or about 607 hectares, and improve habitat on more than 1,000 acres, which is more than 405 hectares, in Alabama and Georgia. Another project aims to restore and improve at least 40,000 acres, or about 16,200 hectares, in Alabama and Florida. A broader project across 7 states aims to plant 13,000 acres of longleaf pine, which is about 5,260 hectares, conduct prescribed burns on 21,000 acres, or about 8,500 hectares, and strengthen endangered species recovery across the region. Those numbers are not there to overwhelm anyone. They show that behind today's hope, there is money, planning, and real work. Closer to the ground, the Longleaf Alliance also reported that in the 2023 to 2024 planting season alone, it and its partners helped plant 5.8 million longleaf pine seedlings across 10,558 acres, which is about 4,270 hectares, on both public and private land. That number sounds beautiful, but it also reminds us of an even more basic truth. Restoration always begins with small things. One small seedling placed into the right soil. One piece of land prepared so a young tree has enough light. One prescribed burn to reduce competition. One rainy season that helps the roots go deeper. One landowner deciding not to rush toward a faster-growing species instead. All of those things, added together over years, are what eventually become restoration across millions of acres. The longleaf pine, just like its own life story, is still teaching people that what becomes vast usually begins with a chain of small, steady acts. Perhaps the most important thing today's longleaf pine restoration movement has understood is this: planting longleaf pine has never been enough by itself. If people simply put trees in the ground without bringing back fire, without restoring grasses and wildflowers, without reopening the light, without controlling the mid-story, without thinking about ecological corridors, and without caring about the species that live alongside longleaf pine, then what grows up may be a pine plantation, but not necessarily a true longleaf pine ecosystem. That is why the documents today keep emphasizing prescribed fire, improved forest structure, reconnecting forests, and aiming for ecosystems that are healthy, functional, capable of regenerating, and rich in complete species relationships. In the end, restoring the longleaf pine means restoring a living order, not just restoring a canopy. So when we look at the recent reports, the most moving thing is not only the number of acres that have increased, but the fact that people seem to be understanding the longleaf pine more accurately than before. In 2025, the Partners of America's Longleaf were able to look back on 15 years of cooperation and announce milestones such as more than 2 million acres, which is about 809,000 hectares, restored through planting and silvicultural work, along with more than 20 million acres of longleaf pine habitat, or about 8.1 million hectares, treated with prescribed fire since 2010. Those milestones do not say that everything is finished. They simply say that a right direction is producing real results. And in an era when too many environmental stories end in loss, the longleaf pine has become one of the rare stories that lets people breathe a little more slowly and think that real hope still exists on this earth. Perhaps that is the most healing part of the entire journey of the longleaf pine. A tree that people once overused, misunderstood in the way it grows, cut off from its fire, and shrank the world around, has now become the very place where people are learning how to cooperate with nature again. Not through beautiful but empty promises, but by relearning the fire cycle, planting the right species, protecting the ground cover, reconnecting forest fragments, supporting private landowners, protecting old trees, and thinking about birds, tortoises, insects, and even groundwater. The longleaf pine has therefore become more than a conservation target. It has become proof that when people are willing to listen long enough, we can still relearn the language of an ecosystem and give back the rhythms it needs in order to keep living on its own. And from that very real hope, the story of the longleaf pine begins to open into its deepest final layer, where one tree shows us not only how to restore a forest, but also what lies at the heart of strength, time, and the connectedness of life. And perhaps by now, after moving through the form of the longleaf pine, the homeland of the longleaf pine, the strange youth of the longleaf pine, a lifespan that stretches like 1 century joined to another, the living world beneath its canopy, the history of people who once depended on it and then helped exhaust it, and even the restoration efforts of today, we begin to realize that the longleaf pine is not only giving us knowledge about a single tree, it is quietly teaching us a much larger lesson about how life truly works. Not every tree can be an individual, a structure, a memory, and the foundation of a vast community all at once. In official descriptions of the longleaf pine system, it is always presented as a fire-dependent ecosystem with an open canopy, an extraordinarily diverse herbaceous layer, and exceptional conservation value. That description alone is enough to show that the longleaf pine is not a closed-off being. It is a tree with the ability to become the architect of an entire living world. One of the first things the longleaf pine teaches us is that living slowly does not mean living weakly. In an age when people often measure value by visible speed, the longleaf pine moves in the opposite direction. It may spend many of its earliest years in the grass stage, making almost no noticeable gain in height, while its roots drive deep and its root collar stores energy in preparation for a very long life ahead. The Longleaf Alliance and Silvix of North America, in their descriptions of the longleaf pine life cycle, both show that this slowness is an adaptive strategy, not helpless delay. The longleaf pine does not waste time. It uses time to do what cannot be seen right away. And perhaps that is one of nature's gentlest lessons. Sometimes real strength does not lie in rising first, but in building deeply enough that when the time comes to stand, you can stand for a very long time. The longleaf pine also teaches that resilience is not always about stiffening yourself against everything that threatens you. In one of the most common human ways of imagining strength, a powerful being is one that fights back against whatever endangers it. But the longleaf pine was shaped in a system where fire returns again and again, and its whole body, from the grass stage to the thick bark of a mature tree, tells a different story. Sometimes, if a living thing wants to endure for the long term, it does not need to eliminate hardship completely. It needs to learn how to adjust itself so it can live within the cycle of that hardship. The United States Natural Resources Conservation Service emphasizes that the longleaf pine system benefits clearly when the natural rhythm of low-intensity fire is restored, while documents from the United States Forest Service repeatedly show that it is the long suppression of fire that weakens this system. So in the world of the longleaf pine, sustainability does not come from locking down every disturbance. It comes from the ability to live faithfully within the very disturbance the ecosystem evolved to need. That is why the longleaf pine forces us to rethink the idea of stability itself. People often like to imagine that a healthy system is one that is as motionless as possible, as undisturbed as possible, as quiet as possible. But the longleaf pine system does not work that way. Conservation and forestry sources describe its healthy state with very different language: fire moving regularly, an open canopy, a rich lower layer, light reaching the ground, regeneration continuing, and species relationships still intact. In other words, the stability of the longleaf pine is not a state of standing still. It is the result of recurring cycles happening in the right rhythm. The very things that may look like mild destruction, such as a periodic surface fire, are what keep the forest from becoming something else entirely. So the longleaf pine teaches a very deep ecological truth. Sometimes what keeps a living system healthy is not the complete removal of disturbance, but the continuation of the right kind of disturbance, so its connections can keep renewing themselves. From there, the longleaf pine teaches another lesson about patience. In the life of the longleaf pine, patience is not passive. It has structure. It has direction. It has a clear biological purpose. The longleaf pine is patient during the grass stage, so it can prepare for height growth. It is patient for decades before entering stable reproductive maturity. It is patient through fires, drought years, failed seed crops, and still continues helping to keep the forest open. Even the restoration of the longleaf pine today demands the same kind of patience. The current plan of America's longleaf sets long-term goals through 2029 and beyond, with its target of 8 million acres, which is about 3.2 million hectares, showing that no one can restore a longleaf pine system in just a few planting seasons. If people want to bring back the longleaf pine, we also have to relearn the slow rhythm of the tree itself. But perhaps what the longleaf pine says most clearly is that life does not truly exist as isolated individuals. The deeper we go into this system, the harder it becomes to speak about the longleaf pine as a single trunk standing alone. The Longleaf Alliance, the National Park Service, and federal agencies all describe the longleaf pine ecosystem through a network. Longleaf pine, ground cover, fire, the red cockaded woodpecker, the gopher tortoise, pollinating insects, reptiles, amphibians, and hundreds of other species, all depending on the open structure of the landscape. So the longleaf pine reminds us that interdependence is not just a few pretty examples in a textbook. Interdependence is the way an entire world keeps its shape. A longleaf pine lets light reach the ground. Light allows grasses and flowers to live. Grasses and flowers feed insects and carry fire. Fire keeps open space for the next generation of trees. From a single trunk, an entire network appears. And the more we understand that, the more clearly we see that no life is ever truly strong when it is cut off from the relationships that sustain it. The longleaf pine also teaches us to value open space and light, two things that are often overlooked because they are not as tangible as wood, water, or soil. But in this system, light is one of the greatest ecological resources of all. The United States Natural Resources Conservation Service emphasizes that regular low-intensity fire maintains an open canopy and a diverse herbaceous understory. Studies on the restoration of longleaf pine savannas also show that planting too densely for timber purposes creates shade in the lower layer and removes many herbaceous species that matter deeply to wildlife, which means that in the world of the longleaf pine, open space is not wasted space. Light is not an afterthought. They are basic conditions that allow smaller forms of life to appear. So the longleaf pine teaches a lesson that feels strange and true at the same time. A rich system is not necessarily one that packs every inch of space full. Sometimes a rich system is one that leaves enough light for other forms of life to take shape. Another lesson the longleaf pine carries inside its wood is ecological memory. Synthesized studies of longleaf pine tree rings show that the trunk can record drought, rainfall, climate variation, and even the history of fire in the past. That makes the longleaf pine more than just a long-lived tree. It becomes a keeper of the landscape's memory. In human life, we often think memory lives in stories, books, or images. But the longleaf pine shows us that land and forests have memories of their own. They simply write those memories in growth, rings, fire scars, canopy structure, and species composition. So when old longleaf pine forests are lost, we are not just losing ancient trees. We are also losing part of the ecological memory of that land. And when the longleaf pine is restored, we are not only planting a future, we are also reconnecting a line of memory that had once been broken. From that memory, the longleaf pine opens into a lesson about restoration. Many environmental stories exhaust people because they end in loss. But the longleaf pine is one of the few examples showing that if we truly understand the logic of an ecosystem, people can still repair at least part of what we have broken. Recent reports from America's longleaf show that restoration and successful management now extend across millions of acres, with prescribed fire surpassing 2 million acres, which is about 809,000 hectares in 2024. But the restoration plans themselves make something equally clear. Planting trees alone is not enough. Fire has to be restored, open structure has to be restored, native understory has to be restored, landscape connections have to be restored, and species relationships have to be restored. That turns longleaf pine restoration into a very quiet moral lesson. Repair is not about rebuilding the outer appearance of what was lost. It is about restoring the processes that once kept it alive. And once we begin to think that way, we start to understand what the longleaf pine is telling us about strength. The strength of the longleaf pine does not lie in standing taller than everything else, even though many of its trees truly are very tall. Its strength does not lie only in longevity either, even though it is the longest-lived of the southern pines. The real strength of the longleaf pine lies in its ability to keep the essential rhythms of life going: light reaching the ground, grass growing, fire passing through, young trees regenerating, other species finding a place to live, and the memory of the landscape being preserved. That is a very different definition of strength from the one people usually carry. It does not place its emphasis on isolation or domination. It places its emphasis on supporting and sustaining a network. The more a living thing can help many other living things continue to exist with it, the deeper its strength becomes. And that is exactly what the longleaf pine has done for thousands of years. Perhaps that is why, when someone stands for a long time in a longleaf pine forest, there is often a feeling that is hard to name. It is not exactly the feeling of looking at something beautiful, even though it is beautiful. It is not exactly the feeling of standing before a natural monument, even though it is truly ancient. It is the feeling of being inside a living order that understands very deeply that if everything is to endure, each part must know how to give space to the others at the right moment. The longleaf pine does not seal off the sky. Fire does not burn everything away. Grass does not fight to take every bit of space from the tree. The other species do not simply arrive, consume the forest, and leave. Everything exists inside a strange and elegant balance between openness and protection, between burning and renewal, between individuality and togetherness. In an age when people are easily drawn into the idea that sustainability means tightly controlling everything, the longleaf pine offers a gentler reminder. Sometimes sustainability means maintaining the right breathing rhythm of a system, and then allowing the parts within it to keep doing their work. And then, once all of that settles in, the longleaf pine brings us very close to the final truth of this journey. A tree can be the architect of an entire living world. Slow living can be a powerful strategy. A healthy system does not need perfect stillness, but the right cycles to keep renewing itself. Light and openness can matter just as much as soil and water. Ecological memory can live in wood, and in the way a landscape still knows how to burn in rhythm. Real restoration is not about rebuilding appearances, but about reconnecting broken relationships. All of those lessons lead us toward one point that is both quiet and deep. The essence of the longleaf pine does not lie in its ability to stand strong by itself, but in its ability to keep the whole network of life around it breathing. And perhaps only when we come close to that point are we truly ready to touch the final truth. The truth that gathers everything the longleaf pine has quietly been teaching us from the beginning of this journey until now. And perhaps now, as this journey begins to draw to a close, what settles inside us is no longer just the image of a tree with long needles, a straight trunk, thick bark, or an ancient forest of the American South. What remains more deeply is the way the longleaf pine has quietly gathered all of those earlier truths into a single meaning. A seed falling onto open ground. A young tree lying still for years like a clump of grass, not because it is fragile, but because it is pouring its entire future down into its roots. A trunk that lives longer than many human lifetimes, carrying in its wood the memory of drought, of rain, of fire, of changes that people have only just begun to learn how to read. A canopy that does not seal off the sky, allowing light to reach the ground, so that grasses, wildflowers, insects, birds, tortoises, and countless other forms of life can still exist. A world once reduced to an almost heartbreaking degree, and yet beginning to return, not through magic, but through patience, knowledge, and enough humility for people to learn the rhythm of nature once again. So if there is one final truth we should carry with us about the longleaf pine, perhaps it is this. The deepest strength in nature does not lie in separation. It lies in relationship. A relationship with fire, not to be destroyed by it, but to be cleared, renewed, and given a path forward. A relationship with time, not to rush upward, but to mature at the right moment. A relationship with place, not to claim every inch of space, but to become the form most perfectly suited to the soil, the sun, the water, and the wind. And a relationship with all the life growing beneath those long clusters of needles, so that a tree does not live only for itself, but helps an entire community keep breathing. Perhaps that is why the longleaf pine always leaves us with a feeling that is hard to name. It does not simply exist within its world, it helps create that world. And when we truly understand that, we also understand why this story was never only about botany. It is also about patience, about connection, about the way the things that seem harshest are sometimes the very things protecting life in a way that is deep, quiet, and enduring. Tonight, if you have stayed with us all the way here, then perhaps you have not only learned more about the longleaf pine, you have traveled through a forest of fire and light, of memory and restoration, of loss and hope, and touched a very gentle truth: that the most enduring forms of life are woven from quiet relationships. Thank you for drifting with Sleepy Drift into knowing on this journey. And now, let your mind grow still like a forest after a gentle fire. When the ground is still warm, the air has already softened, and life quietly continues all around us. Wishing you a peaceful night, a deep and restful sleep, and we will see you again on the next gentle journey into knowledge.